Hello. Hi there. Bonjour. My name is Claude Morin. And Tanzé to all the people of this territory. You have access to my artist statement at this website. It'll be included in the chat. This speaks to going to the artist's way, my daughter and I in Japan. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on, as a settler, Treaty 4 land and the territory of the Métis. It speaks to the advantages that my ancestors got from this land, the gifts from the land. This is my mother's mother, grandmother, her territory. And I spent some time revisiting that territory and seeing how she fits into my ancestors. I'm presently investigating my ancestry, given the fact that it's part of a healing process of discovering how they benefited my life and how possibly I'm still carrying some of the negativity that might have occurred, and that there has to be reparation. This is where see evidence of colonial times and some of the remnants. This is actually the home where my grandmother lived at some point. They had a store that was still up when I went to visit. In Clairière. Now, I want to speak to the philosophy, my philosophy of doing doing art, the way I am trying to follow. And serendipity gave me this quote that reflects my search. A friend came over and she says, well, you seem to be speaking to this person that I know. And this was a few days before this presentation. It speaks to that spirit that comes and helps. I'd like to read it. Schweitzer observed that there are two types of artists. The subjective, who use their personality as a wellspring of all their art and live as a law unto themselves. And the objective, whose artistic personality exists independently of the human, and whose art is not impersonal, but super personal, channeling the universal and the eternal through the vessel of their being. What I'm searching is to be part of the latter, the second. I have a great confidence that there are emanations and emergences of spirit form that helps me to be the vessel of the universal, what I would call a universal good. So this is what I'd like to speak to in the rest of the presentation. I was very touched that this piece was accepted in the Saskatchewan Craft Council art show called Dimensions. It speaks to my search of the physical expression of what I would call the spirit of the art piece. It speaks to what I've been touched by in my life. The land. My grandfather was a farmer in Gravelbourg, Saskatchewan. And I spent time with him, very valuable time, and became very connected to the topography and the spirit of the land. This speaks to this emerging glazes and oxides and earths and glazes and clays and ochres taken from the land. Many of them were taken right from the western part of Canada to create this emerging happening, I would call it. I even did use in the darker parts that you see at the bottom, ochre that is considered a sacred ochre by First Nations. I had permission to use that sparingly. I was going to speak a little bit of my background that would maybe clarify some of my thinking today. I was raised in a French community and what you would call today a residential schools. But I had the benefit of going back home every day. My education was one of letters and science. I fell into this scientific mode, still influences today, as if you look at my artist statement. I speak of my science background, my study of quantum physics. Nevertheless, I believe that in the complexity of this universe, the infinite complexity, I do not fit into that materialism or the actual physicalism of existence. I believe there's more to it. And like I mentioned in my statement, quantum physics speaks to that mystery. Briefly, we could get into it, but I won't extensively. Briefly, they mention things like entanglement, which is two particles that speak to each other at a distance, speaking to the interconnectivity of the whole universe. They speak of virtual particles, which are creating the forces that keep everything together. What is that? They speak of waves and the wave theory. It's what I'm beginning to understand as when creation of this existence occurred, it was from a principle that is fundamental, that speaks of the spirit, and from whence came matter and what created this particular piece. So based on that, I'd like to speak of, the actual physical emergence of these events that occurred. And like I say, I used ochres and the iron and the silica seemed to get together and produce a landscape similar to what we see on our Mother Earth. Or now, you have, Perseverance checking things out on Mars, similar to those landscapes in many ways. But the creation of the crystalline structure in these pieces and the colors representing the prairie where I've lived. The landscape, the colors, and the emergence of a crystalline phenomena that is somewhat unexplainable. That's what intrigues me. And, a little story, I showed this to some of my customers and I rubbed my hand against it and cut my fingers. Very, very sharp crystalline structure that you see in some of the pieces. This is another piece that was in the show. Our grandmother's spirits are with us. Is that a emanation from some grandmother or an emergence of some phenomena that's trying to speak to us? I commit the piece to the kiln and leave nature take its course. Fire and air and the forces of this universe come into play. Almost looks like the frothing of water. shorelines, and sandy beaches. This is another piece that was in the show. It speaks to the landscape that partly humans have created, breaking the land, hoping for water. And so I like to see what's in the piece, speak to my wife, Barb Fraser, who's a writer, and ask her to write me poetry that relates to the piece, as you can see in this case. Heavy ridges, part of the landscape, could be man-made or natural. In the South Country here, we have the Badlands, mountainous. We say mountainous, but it's little bumps on the prairie. Territory where the buffalo roamed. COVID for me was a time of searching. I had the opportunity to work in isolation in the studio, but I spent some time investigating my philosophy background, which I took philosophy when I was in a Quebec college. And I come across this fellow on YouTube called John Vervaeke, who spoke of awakening from the meaning crisis. I think our society has a meaning crisis, and he relates that to all of the ideology that came from the Greeks to present day. And I took one of his classes online, and he elaborates that quite clearly and speaks of Neoplatonism, Plato, and how Plato played quite an extensive role in defining our present day paradigm of how we think. Nevertheless, he explains that we need to go back maybe to Plato and understand his more fundamental message that has been somewhat corrupted and lost. Today, the meaning crisis is a consequence of what religion used to do, give meaning, has been lost, and people are finding it very hard to replace it with anything. John Vervaeke speaks of Plato's dialogue and how the dialogue can lead to dialogos. Dialogos is that spirit you get when you're with other human beings and are searching for the good. This was a very touching event in my life where I went to Japan and saw Hiroshima. And this speaks to Plato's cave. He says, we only see the shadow on the walls of the cave. But really, we have to move out of the cave and come to a wisdom. The wisdom of what we need today is to deal with events of the past, like the atomic bomb. It was a very troubling sight, this memorial in Japan. The Greeks speak of searching for truth, beauty, and wisdom, or the good. That's what I would like to do in my artwork. Go find the spirit of what speaks to our fundamental real nature, which is the good. Through self-transcendence, Vervaeke says, as we dialogue in a dialogos way where we find the spirit, we will self-transcend through our intuitions and move from one frame of reference to another frame of reference. And First Nation people say, every 7 years, humans do that, move from one frame to another in their understanding of the spirit. Speaks to the nature changing and somehow renewing itself, but things disappear, disintegrate. My art should be speaking to that and the synchronicity of events. These are some of my art pieces that I haven't shown before. I'd like you to have a quick peek. The landscapes, the expressions of what I call emergence found in these pieces. The study of how they reflect our inner first principle, which is what is left from our beginning, or the beginning, the archetypes. Trying to work with that. And I'm trying to work with paper and clay, trying to reflect the infinite complexity, as in the background is hidden to us, the foreground is a piece we know, the animal, the fish. Speaks to Japanese concepts of evoking subtlety instead of just using words and propositional language, another form of knowledge. The Japanese speak to that spirit in their tea ceremony. I'm trying to do work with the tree, which is to me a very spiritual living organism, a very spirit in the bonsais, bonsai bowls, paper, Japanese paper I collected when I was in Japan, putting colors on, shinkolei, paper over paper. Nevertheless, there are mysteries in our universe that are unexplainable, and the tree is my inspiration. Thank you. I'll be looking at the questions.
Stop sharing. There's no questions. There's no questions.
I don't have any questions. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Oh, there's one question. One question. Go to Q&A. Q&A over there. Yeah.
Okay.
Can we get, where can we get some of the pieces?
These pieces are, that some of them that you saw are in Art Now. They're available on the Sask Galleries website. So go to saskgalleries.ca and you'll find some of those pieces that are featured in the show. Those pieces are for sale. Some of the other ones that I've revealed are not for sale. I anticipate putting them in future shows. Thank you for your interest. Thank you very much for being part of this.